podcasts to use to practice your listening, and each podcast will be about 25 minutes in length. Some of them might be shorter, and some of them might be longer, but in general, each podcast will be somewhere around 25 minutes long. So you have a pretty long podcast and a lot of material to practice your listening. So in each podcast, I'm planning on talking about 2 or 3 different topics each time. For example, maybe today I want to talk about travel and food. Or maybe tomorrow I want to talk about cars or other everyday routine topics. Really, I'm going to talk about everything. So hopefully the topics will be interesting for you, and they'll be new each time, and it will be a good resource for you overall. I'm going to be speaking very clearly, as clear as I can. You can hear an example of that with this intro podcast. I'm speaking pretty clearly, right? My voice is relatively easy to understand, easier than most native speakers. And so I'm going to be speaking pretty clearly, and I'll be speaking just a little bit more slowly than I would normally speak with other Americans or other native speakers. So I'm not speaking really slowly. I'm not speaking at a really unnatural pace, but I'm speaking just a little bit more slowly and a little more clearly than the average American. So with each podcast, you'll also have access to the transcript. So the transcript will help you understand all the words and phrases you missed the first time around. Maybe if you listen to me right now, you can understand most of what I'm saying, but not everything. And so the transcript will help you fill in the gaps for those missing words or missing phrases, etc. The transcripts will be auto-generated, so they won't be perfect. I'll try to edit them a little bit before uploading them, but honestly, I probably won't have the time to edit all the mistakes in the transcripts, but hopefully there won't be too many. So that will be a great resource for you as well to help you with these podcasts. So now let's talk about how to use this podcast. So first of all, who is this podcast for? Who should be listening to the Listening Time podcast? Well, ideally, if you have an English level of lower intermediate or higher beginning, this is probably a good resource for you. For example, if you have an A2 level of English or a B1 level of English, this will be perfect for you to practice with. However, if you have a higher level, let's say a B2 level, that's okay. You can use this podcast to help you understand even better, to help you improve your listening. It should still be a good tool because I will undoubtedly use certain words or phrases that are new to you. So even if you can understand 95% of what I'm saying, this podcast should still be a good resource for you because of the sheer amount of vocabulary that you'll hear during this podcast. And on the other side, if you have an A1 level, this podcast will probably be too difficult for you. I'm not speaking very slowly. I'm speaking a little slow, but not very slowly. And I'm going to be using normal vocabulary that I would normally use with other native speakers. So if you're at a lower beginning level, like A1 or maybe a very low A2 level, this might be too hard for you. But if you're really motivated, if you really want to listen to this podcast, that's great. And you have the transcript. So the transcript should help you if you read through it and look up all the new words, all the new phrases, and then listen to this podcast again. That will definitely be helpful for you. But ideally, this podcast is for people who are at a level where they can understand unnatural, scripted speech very easily, but they can't understand authentic native speech that is spoken at a real pace, a real speed. If that's your level, this podcast is perfect for you. The reason I made this podcast, or I'm making this podcast, is to help students transition between that really fake, scripted, beginner listening practice type videos to real, authentic content. So maybe you can't understand American podcasts made for American listeners, but using the really artificial, fake listening practice lessons that you find online or in paid programs, maybe those are too unnatural or too easy for you, and you need help transitioning between those beginner level programs and real speech, right? So this podcast will be a podcast for you to transition to real speech. So I'm speaking without a script, okay? I didn't plan the words that I'm saying right now. I'm speaking spontaneously. So you're hearing me, Connor, speaking normally, just a little bit slower and a little bit more clearly. But the words I'm saying, the vocabulary I'm using, all the things I'm saying are normal for me. I'm not reading something right now. And that's what makes this podcast really useful, is that I'm not writing scripts for it. So if I write a script and read it, you're not going to hear authentic speech, right? I'm going to be reading, and that's not real speech. But if I do the podcast like this, without a script, then you're going to be able to hear what real speech sounds like, just in a clearer and slower way, right? So that should be helpful for you, and I hope you find this type of talking, this type of audio useful. I know I do. When I learn other languages, I always search for podcasts or other audio like this, where it's a native speaker who's speaking maybe a little bit more clearly than the average native speaker. And I use those videos, podcasts, audios to improve my listening when I'm learning other languages. So hopefully this will be a good tool for you to do that. So, as I mentioned before, this podcast is more for learners who are not ready for real content yet. If you have a very high level and you can understand real content, there's really no need for you to use this podcast. But of course, if you want to, you can listen. I'm happy to have you here listening to this podcast. So, in terms of how to use it exactly, I recommend two ways. you can listen to this podcast actively, or you can listen to it passively. So, when I say actively, I mean that you sit down, put your headphones in, pull up the transcript, and listen and do nothing else. That's active listening. Of course, that's fantastic. That's very helpful if you can do that, right? That will be the most beneficial way for you to listen to this podcast. And when you do that, you can read the transcript or you can just listen to the podcast. It depends on how you want to use it, how much you understand. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But before that, I want to talk. So if you don't have a bunch of free time, but you still want to practice your English listening, you can listen to this podcast passively. What does that mean? Well, while you're doing something else, for example, driving to work, washing the dishes, cleaning the house, exercising, things like that, where you're doing one thing, but your brain is free, you can use that time to listen to this podcast passively. You can use this podcast during that time, and of course, you won't be 100% focused on the podcast. You won't be 100% focused on what you're listening to, but you'll still be able to listen, learn new vocabulary, train your listening, etc. So you can listen to the podcast actively or passively or both. You probably have time or situations where you can do both in one day. So in terms of the transcript, right, you might